We're gonna get started. Get your donuts, get your coffee. So you have what?
That is one place. Services. I use it.
I'm just gonna be a fan of this, right? I already had this one over here and say, as long as you're trading it, you can walk in the gym.
When you think that you're.
Well, thanks, I think we're just gonna go ahead and get started. We got lots of content, I hope, we got some time to discuss some pictures. We got some pictures, that's good, that's good, well, let's open with the prayer as always. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty God, you created us in your image and blessed us with memory and reason, skill. Help us to use those gifts to your honor and glory as we learn about you and learn about the church and hopefully learn what the church can do next to your honor and glory. All this we ask in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Take it away, Paul. Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you here. I actually should hear that when I first retired, people would ask me, well, if you miss anything being retired, as I thought about it. And I said, well, the only thing that I really miss is that people don't take notes anymore when I talk. I don't see anybody taking notes, but I appreciate you listening. You know, it's when you're talking about something that happened 500 years ago, sometimes it's just hard to make it seem real. Maybe not real, I mean, such a different world. And so I'm gonna start by just mentioning my own emotional state right now about current events, not to be political, but I'll just say when, you know, Kate and I go up to Minnesota for the summer. And the day we got there, coincidentally, was the day that two state legislators were, well, one was assassinated, the other 60 wounded and their family members. And then coincidentally, but terribly, the day we left was the day that the church and school in South Minneapolis was shot up, and children killed, and a couple of 80-year-old parishioners severely wounded. And then this week, I mean, we've had a major political assassination this week. And within the last year, we've seen the President of the United States had two attempts on his life. And all I can say is that without examining it anyway, it's just, I feel we're at a time where things aren't working right. And that something needs, I don't know what needs to be done, but something needs to be done, or something's got to happen to break this terrible spell we're in. And by analogy, I'd like you to think about the 1400s and 1500s that way. You know, as I told you last week, the economy's collapsing, there are wars, there are revolutions, there are assassinations. The whole world seems to be crumbling. And understandably, people they start to re-examine their most fundamental beliefs, and above all, they turn to the church, and they find a church that is in disarray. Not one pope, but two popes, sometimes even three popes. A church to some extent, I think it's fair to say, was corrupted by its great wealth and power, and distracted by its great power and wealth. And people are flailing around and desperately feel something's gotta happen. And for them, more than us, they look to the church, they look to their faith, they are, however devout we may be, we are not devout the way they were. The world revolved around their faith in a way that it may be central to us, but it was their very essence for them and their culture. Let's see, this is. So I wanted to find a, I gave you the last week of all these very wrong, but I wanted to find something that sort of symbolized all this. And this is probably it. No, if you ever studied history and you had a textbook, I'll bet you anything that said the Middle Ages ended in 1453. And you may not remember why they chose 1453. There are two events that happened that the historians would kind of hang their hat on. One, the less important one, was the end of the 100 before. The victory of France and the invasions. But probably more importantly is this, and this is a painting of the Sultan of the Turks entering Constantinople. And the fall of Constantinople in 1453 was a symbolic moment. It's hard to describe. Constantinople was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. As long as Constantinople was Christian, there was still an emperor of Rome. What's different from the emperor 2,000 years ago? It's still the Roman Empire, still the Roman emperor. And the fall, Constantinople, long last definitively, the Roman Empire was gone, and the Turks were invading Europe, working up the Danube Valley, basically, ultimately to siege Vienna. And so, from a kind of, even if you were common everyday peasant, you knew that something really profoundly important was going on politically. And another example of it that I forgot to mention last week, but I think it's better to mention quick, is the popular response to this anxiety. And it's this. This is Nellis Harm, is one of the most influential books ever written. It was written in the 1400s. It literally is the Hammer of the Witches. It's a textbook on how to hunt and eliminate witches. And what historians call the great witchcraft craze that swept across the Christian world. In the United States, you all know about Salem witchcraft laws, and this is just Europe. It lasted a long time, but you may not realize how widespread and intense it was. It's estimated that tens of thousands, not hundreds, not thousands, but tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds, they don't know for certain, but at least tens of thousands of witches were convicted and executed, either lynched or burned at the stake. And sadly, most of them were women, although you can't be a male witch, but it was, and you don't want to think this is a testimony to religious faith, but it is. It's a belief in the power of Christianity, so the reality of what we might call magic. Officially, it was heresy, so they were being executed not for being witches, but witchcraft was the heresy. And I don't want to belabor the point. Keep that in the kind of just the popular mind, this anxiety, this fear, this pervasive through all classes. Now we can start thinking about reactions to it, and I want to start with something that is, I must have when I was school, it was tedious. I'm not a philosopher or an intellectual historian, and when they shift from battles to philosophers, my mind would kind of drift away in the past. But I've got to sell it to you. Coincidental with the medieval crisis, the 1300s and thereafter, there was an intellectual revival going on, an elite intellectual revival going on, which we come to call the Renaissance. And originally it meant the rebirth of civilization, but actually Petrarch, the first person to identify this movement, called it renovation, the renewal of Christendom. And it's honest, you can walk into any museum and, all right, here's a medieval painting. Here's a Renaissance painting. Pretty obvious. I'm not an art historian, but even I can see, this is. They're not painted that, there might be over 100 years apart in the paintings of them, but something has changed. Well, I don't want to get into whether it's improvement, but it's changed. Same thing with architecture. Here's a nice medieval church. It's not just any old church, it's shown. One of the greatest in the cathedrals, probably a lot of you visited, certainly worth the trip if you have. And here's a Renaissance building. Another beautiful building, we may probably visit it. But it sure is different. I mean, there's a tangible artistic and intellectual change going on. And more important to us in this context is what writers and artists were doing. To some extent, in this crisis, there were a lot of writers and philosophers who said, well, look, what's our example? What's our best example of a really successful culture and civilization? And it was the ancient world, particularly in Italy. They look back to the Roman Empire. So those were the good old days. And things were better then. Or at least seemingly better. And what gets started is a kind of revival of interest in ancient forms and modes of thought, and even just revival of interest in reading ancient writers they hadn't even read or studied for a long time. A revival of interest in ancient languages. People started studying Greek, and they started noticing the difference between their Latin and the Latin of 1,000 years earlier. And as a renewal of interest, the problem for them was when they go back to antiquity and they say, well, how wonderful Cicero is, how magnificent the Aeneid is, something like that. The problem is all of that literature is not Christian, it's pagan. And how can they reconcile their Christianity with their admiration of these pagan arts? Anyway, just to give you a kind of quick and dirty history of humanism, probably the earliest person who was thought of as a humanist is Petrarch. He's a famous poet. Some of you may have read him. He's a famous poet, writing in the 1300s. Italian. You'll know by a lot of these people are churchmen, because the church is where you get your education. And Petrarch is, he did another things that were memorable, but he lived from 1304 to 1374. Probably his biggest impact was popularizing Cicero. Saying, we should be looking at Cicero. Even he is a pagan, he's got lots of teachers. And one famous essay in particular is sometimes known as the father of the essay. Is a literary form. He started writing essays, and one of them is just a description of this mountain climbing experience, climbing Mount Ventoux, the ascent of Mount Ventoux. It doesn't sound like much, but as an essay, it's a celebration of the glory of life on earth, without any overt religious. Just the mountain was there. He climbed it. It's beautiful, but he didn't put in any religious writ on it. It was just, in essence, secular. This is Boccaccio. What's the word game played with letters? Yeah. And Boccaccio's a nice beat, right? And we remember, among other things, Florentine, he's a writer, and he starts writing kind of earthy tales. The Decameron is what he's supposed to be. So splendid collection of tales. And you remember, it's the idea that the Decameron was that a group of wealthy people have fled Florence during the plague, and they go off the countryside where they think they're safe from infection, and they spend their time out there telling each other stories. A generation later, people have been there on Nolan, people like me have not getting a clue who he is. But his most famous essay is called On the Dignity of Man, celebrating humanity, what wonderful creatures we are. And he has all the appropriate Christian gloss to that, but it really is we are really special creatures. So this is just if you will, the foam on the surface of the movement. Maybe in terms of what we're interested in, the most interesting. Oh, I got these out of the work. Here we go. This is Lorenzo Valla. You know, see him in cleric right here. And he's a great scholar. He travels around Europe, visits monasteries, finds lost manuscripts, or re-edits them. And his most famous accomplishment that had powerful influence on religious mood at the time was his exposure of the donation of Constantine. I think I have a picture of it here. The donation of Constantine is a document in which the Emperor Constantine, he comes to the Pope and he says, according to the text, I'm going to farm a new city over in what we're going to call Constantinople. And Pope, I'm going to leave you in charge of the West. You're in command of the West, and I'll just rule the East. And it's a good document to have in your back pocket when you're having arguments with people about who's running things around here. And not surprisingly, the popes tried it out from time to time. I didn't even bother bringing out a picture of the text, but it's a good document to have. I guess what you might call a title search if you were thinking of the West as a state. But what Valla did in studying it and analyzing it, he proved it was a forgery. That it had been forged in the 8th century. And he did this by examining the Latin and say that's not 4th century Latin, it's 8th century Latin. Same way you might, if somebody said, look at this, I just found this play called Romeo and Juliet, and it was just written I just wrote it last week. And somebody said, that looks like 16th century, which is not mine. And same thing with Latin. And so, to put it mildly, this is embarrassing. More or less disillusioning. And ultimately, of course, it sort of chips away at the authority of the papacy itself. Now, this movement started in Italy, but it spread north. There's a related movement which we call Northern Humanism, very clever. And what makes Northern Humanism different is that they focus more on scripture and church texts. They say, yeah, the idea going back to, let's go back to the earliest Christian sources and see if we really understand that. And they start searching for earlier texts and more authentic texts. You want to remember, for example, that the Bible they're using was written in the 4th century, was translated into Latin in the 4th century. So if we can find earlier texts to that, what are the earlier versions like, and what can we learn from them? And they also start studying Hebrew, so that they can read the what we would call the Old Testament in the original language, as opposed to the Latin and 4th century Latin translation of it, and Greek, which had not been particularly commonly used in the West until the fall of Constantinople. What had happened is with the fall of Constantinople, all the Christian scholars who could get away did, and they moved west fleeing the fall of Constantinople. So that brought a lot of people into Western Europe that were familiar with an easy, comfortable use of Greek texts. So just some examples. This is John Collett. He was dean of St. Paul's Cathedral. And he's famous for writing a new modern translation of the letters to St. Paul. A new improved, I guess what you said. And writing essays about St. Paul. And he's probably the first person that we're aware of, who started suggesting and arguing, which we're familiar with now, the idea that not all the letters that we say from St. Paul are actually by St. Paul. That some of them are letters that were written in the style of St. Paul, but the authors are different, and he argues this on the basis of the language used. And I'm certain when you read scripture, often if you look at the chapter heading with the book headings in the Bible, they'll probably say this is, we're certain this is St. Paul, or they'll say, oh, this is attributed to St. Paul. That's, again, it's kind of just a little unsettled. This is a French scholar, Lefebvre Pitot. He's a professor at the University of Paris and also a humanist. And he's memorable because or a good example of how plainly these ideas can be disruptive is, I think, probably the most famous thing he wrote was something called the Quintuplex Psalter, which is an edition of Psalms in 5 columns. So it's the book of Psalms, but with 5 different versions of it. The original Hebrew, and then the Greek translation, and then 3 modern language, well, a Latin translation, and then modern language.
Wow.
And if you haven't heard before, there's an Italian phrase, "Tradire traduce," to translate is to lie. and to suddenly, I want to read the Psalm and see what they teach me. And then if which version am I going to read? Which one is authoritative? I think we probably all agree it's the Hebrew text, but not many of us are going to read that. I certainly can't. So then you're suddenly, it's kind of like things are getting shaky intellectually, even in something as important as letters, St. Paul, as the book of Psalms. This is mainly, inside the intellectual. This is not the average pessimist that's sitting around reading this stuff. But all the people who think and are active, can be clergy or in academia, are just encountering these unsettled, disruptive ideas. Probably the most famous of the to us of the northern humanists, one is Erasmus and the other is Thomas More. I'm certain you've all seen movies about Thomas More, if nothing else, and you all know that Erasmus was a really influential writer. I don't know, maybe you've actually read Utopia, but that's Moore's most famous thing. But in some extent, Erasmus particularly incarnated the problems of the church at the time. He was the illegitimate son of a priest, which meant he couldn't be a priest himself, even though he was extremely devout. So he became, he didn't say, oh, they don't think it's right instead, but that's what happened. He became a scholar and writer, and he wrote any number of wonderfully influential texts, all of which are trying to, in various ways, reconcile this new learning with traditional Christianity into Christ's. Now, actually, probably the most dangerous people of all, if you want to think of it as a danger, is those people who said, here's what we'll do. We'll translate the Bible into everyday language. We'll translate it into English, French, so that people can hear the word themselves. Most people wouldn't be able to read it, but they could at least be read to them. And they could hear the word of the Lord. But the trouble is, if you let people hear it, they may not all hear exactly the same thing, or they may not react to it the same way. It became so. I still remember one day I was flipping the archives in Toulouse, reading court orders, array of the Parlement of Toulouse, and I just kind of came across this issue, this ruling was issued in 1540, Then in Toulouse, starting in 1540, it was a capital crime if you were caught reading the letters of St. Paul without written permission from the bishop. And next time you're reading St. Paul, or, ask yourself, would I be, do I want to read this so much I'll take the chance of being burned at the stake or being caught reading? I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying, everybody was aware that if everybody hears these texts in a language they understand, it kind of vitiates the authority of clergy. It says everybody, listen here, follow your own conscience. And of course, in England, the first person to issue a complete translation in English was John Wycliffe. He issued it in 1382 that published then, which means he released handwritten copies of this before they were readily available. And you remember what happened to him when, among other things, they found this out. He was already dead by the time they found out, so they dug him up and burnt his bones, just to make sure. It was a dangerous thing to translate. And then Tyndale published his English translation in the 1530s. And what made him even more different from Wycliffe, Wycliffe had just translated the traditional Latin Bible. Wycliffe translated from the original Greek and Hebrew sources. So, you got a translation of he got in a lot of trouble, just leave it at that. And it's disruptive, especially by 1536, it can be printed. So you don't have one handwritten copy or 10 handwritten copies. You can have hundreds of copies. And who knows when they can get their hands on those texts and start reading. So this is all the kind of scholarship and the climate of opinion into which people like Luther, Calvin, and Ignatius Loyola, all the reformers are raised in this period of ferment and of transition. And they're hearing all these things. Think of all these people are born in the 1400s. We start paying attention to them. They're growing up in the middle of this world. And they're being the reformers, most of them are extremely well educated, very thoughtful, very devout people who are just trying to come to grips with all this new learning. Desperately looking for answers to questions that are profoundly important in the world. So that's for the intellectual side. I'm gonna change gears now. Let's see what this is as good as anything. I want you to set the context for the reformers, which was next week you'll hear about Luther, and when we get to that, you're gonna hear about Calvin, his crown. But what else is going on in the world that is just changing things? Maybe the most important change since the invention of agriculture. Think of one of the questions I'm giving you is a discussion question is, what has changed in your lifetime? What's the most important change in your lifetime? And the question is, has anything that has changed your lifetime, I don't care whether it's a computer or cell phone, it's changed the world. Has it challenged your faith? Has it disrupted your understanding? But this kind of change in the midst of this crisis. The first innovation that we see in the 1400s, gunpowder. I don't. This is my specialty, so I can go on for 7 days about this, but just guns are important. Gunpowder is important, it makes a difference. For one thing, it's not. It didn't change things overnight. This is an early rifle, and you can imagine that. I bet at most you get one shot before they ride you down, but boy, that one shot could probably, pierce armor and knock a man off the horse. So maybe you don't have to be rich enough to own a horse and a suit of armor to be a soldier. Anybody can be a soldier. And with the passage of time, those guns got bigger. This is a nice cannon from the late 1400s. And the important thing is, not only is it just bigger, you look at the size of those cannonballs, is the explosive force is such that they can knock down stone walls. All those beautiful castings, all those beautiful walls, they're no longer secure. You think you're safe behind your walls? Gotta build new walls, or better yet, move your fort underground. But I'm not gonna get into military architecture. But that's a big change. It changes the nature of warfare. It changes the availability of warfare in terms of who can fight. It makes these were called the engines of war. It's when the term engineering emerges, building the engines of war. Second one, even more obvious, I suppose, to all of us. Right, we all recognize this is John. Well, I don't know that it's instant, but the coming of the printing press. And you all know that it was a revolution, but just think how the spread of ideas could have changed if you can print things. And take most obvious example, when Luther packed up his theses, 95, I think it's 95, am I right? It's 95, yeah, 95 theses. He just tacked it up on the door. It never occurred to somebody to take it and say, well, why don't we print this out and send it out? But imagine how ideas can spread and you lose control of what's out there. And of course, Gutenberg's most famous book. Anybody know where this is? Yeah, that's from the message. If you haven't seen it, it's worth stopping by and just say, wow, there is a revolution you're looking at.
Yeah, they have a copy, they have one of those in the Rand Center.
Yeah, this is a picture of the one. Yeah. I mean, you don't get from the page, it's like, some sense of,
They do turn the pages.
do they? I didn't.
Well, the curators turn pages ever so.
So you're automatically in this section.
Well, it doesn't settle into one.
Oh, I didn't thought about it.
Yeah.
Anyway, the point is, in some ways, printing the Bible is important, but it's also just fly sheets with 95 questions and or short essays that and gradually what happens is once you're printing, then more and more people learn to read. Probably before printing, only a tiny number of people didn't know how to read. I can't one of the story about when our nephew Chuck was about 4 years old, we were visiting, and his sister said to Chuck, "Well, I don't have time right now. Ask your aunt to read that to you." And he turned and said, "You mean she can read too?" No. So, gunpowder, printing. The last one is the compass. It became possible to do, the compass had been understood much earlier, but it's only in the late 1400s that it becomes a regular instrument for navigation. And as you know, people started going further and further, and eventually they ran into a whole world they didn't even know existed. Actually, at first they thought they'd gotten all the way around to India, but obviously they were wrong. And the reason I brought this in is, I don't know how important you realize I won't say Columbus, but his voyage was, because the launch was springs out called the Columbian Exchange. Right? All of the things that were available in Europe were not available in America, and all these were available in America that were not available in Europe. So, chocolate from South America to the Eastern Hemisphere, corn, potatoes, tobacco, squash, peppers. And then the other way. Cattle. Horses, no Indian ever rode a horse before Columbus. Pigs. Wheat. Sugar, rice. Suddenly, the whole world was a single ecosystem. And you could, just think of it, before 1492, nobody ever ate a French fry in France. In Italy, nobody ever had a pizza. Right? Because the peppers and the pepperoni come from the New World. Well, certainly nobody ever had a taco. Corn, beef,
Tomatoes.
cheese, tomatoes. Life wasn't really worth living, so ignorance is interesting. And then maybe the most important thing is Copernicus, another person born in the 1400s. When Copernicus was born, everybody knew, using what we call the Ptolemaic system, that the earth was in the center of God's creation. And everything else in creation revolved around us. Right? I don't know if you can see it here, but here's the earth and the hemispheres, and then we have Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun. See, the sun is the fourth thing got the sun. The sun is going around us. And there's a certain egocentrism, I suppose, but you know, I don't know if you had read about paradise and consciousness, but you know, it's not a stupid system. It works very well in a lot of ways, but it's clearly wrong. You know, once they got more information. And this is what we're all familiar with now. It's called the Copernican system. The sun is at the center of our universe, and the planets, including Earth, go around. Now that, I don't know how big that strikes you as a revolution, but it is one. And let me put it to you in these terms. It's revolutionary in two ways. By showing that Ptolemy was wrong, he said, you know what, are we smarter than the ancients? We know something they didn't know. And then suddenly the new world is discovered. There's worlds out there that the ancients didn't even know were better formed than them. Maybe we've got to reconsider our reverence for antiquity. They weren't so great after all. And then in terms of religion, what does it mean if we are not at the center of God's creation? God is still important, and we are surely His most important creation. We won't doubt that, of course. But we're not at the center of it. God has much more going on than we begin to comprehend. So, intellectual change, and if you will, cultural, technological, economic revolution. New ways of making war, new ways to communicate, new foods to eat, new things to smoke, because, you know, everything is changing. The world is just changing so rapidly, you can't keep up with it. And it's in that world that Luther and Calvin and the rest of them come. Lastly, so I have two sets of discussions for you. Instead of gossiping about your grandchildren, take a shot at the questions. The first one is easy, but just think about it. The Reformation coincided with scientific and technological revolution. We've lived through a lot of revolutions too. What do you think the most important revolution of your lifetime is? And without any help, did any of these changes change your faith or challenge your faith or force you to reevaluate? or reconsider your faith. I'm not arguing that these changes did. Have you lived through anything that has challenged you? In terms of thing? And then the more important question, I've given you two sacred texts, one from the Old Testament, the New Testament. And I've given you 5 different translations of each one into English. I gave you the original if you want to try to repeat what you agree. Imagine you were running a pretty press around 1500. Somebody said, we want to publish a bestseller. The Bible, everybody will want to buy that. He says, fine, get me a copy of the Bible, I'll send it. Fine. And so he says, well, here are 5 copies of the Bible. Which one do you want to use? I deliberately chose them because they're each different. And I really could love to know which one you chose and why. Okay, thank you.
In just a few minutes, Lorian and Robin recommend to help set up children's church, and if 2 or 3 folks are able to help them, it'd be great. Thanks.
Okay, anything about it?
All that.